Shalom Aleichem Rabotai. We are continuing in the Mishnah Yomi with the last Mishnah, Mishnah Tes, in the fourth parak, and we'll be starting Bezrat Hashem the fifth parak. Hanotea et karmo al shesh esrei amma, shesh esrei amma. Someone who plants a vineyard with a spacing between each row of vines of 16 amma, meaning there is a 16 amma gap between every single row of vines. Muter l'havi zera l'sham. He could bring other crops in between. Now this is interesting because having a 16 amma gap, the Mefarshim say, is not really a vineyard. It's individual rows of vines, but not a vineyard. If we recall the last few days, we've described how a vineyard is, according to Beis Hillel at least two rows that are close together. We talked about yesterday, they have to be fairly close together, and if there's a fence in between or a large road in between, that would intervene. And 16 amot in between is quite a large area. It's a road 16 amot wide, can be considered a reshus or rabim. And if you have the rows of a vineyard 16 amma apart, it's not even a vineyard, it's individual rows. And then the vines revert to the same halacha we saw by vegetables or by grains, that they would need a 6 tefachim gap between those vines and another space. Once it's not a vineyard, it doesn't get that 4 amot avodat hakerem around it. If it's simply rows and not a kerem, then it doesn't get that 4 amma avodat hakerem buffer area, and it only needs 6 tefachim. So the Mishnah continues, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Maaseh b'Solomon. There was actually a Maaseh that illustrates this point. Be'echad shenatat karmo shesh esrei amma. Somebody planted rows, and it's ironic, he says planted his vineyard, but we're going to see what he's doing in a moment. He planted all of his vines 16 amma apart. Hayahofech se'ar shtei shorot letzad echad v'zorei et hanir. And what he would do is he would take the se'ar. Now se'ar means hair, but here it means the vines and the leaves. So the plants are in the ground, and he's taking the vines and leaves of 2 rows, and he's putting them inward. So those 2 rows face each other, and then the opposite side, he's planting with a different species. So what's going on is he has 2 rows of vines, and both of them he trains the vines and the leaves to go to the inside, and then outside of those 2 rows of vines on both sides, he's planting a different species. And on the next year, he would actually take the vines and train them in the other direction and plant the other side. So he was doing a form of crop rotation, of planting crop in opposite years and having the vines in that area in opposite years, because he could move the vines and change which direction they're trained. And they asked a shaila to the sages, the ancient sages, it seems even maybe before the Mishnah, and they said that this was allowed, this kind of crop rotation was allowed because Lamaisa he had a 16 amma spacing. Their makel, they say even if they're 8 ammas apart, it's still mutter. That's surprising because the first Mishnah in the parak we said even Beis Hillel needs 16 amma for the karaha to kerem, the bald spot of the kerem, to plant there, but they differentiate. They say this isn't a bald spot. This simply never became a kerem because it's so far apart. They're farther apart than the 4 amma avodas kerem gap. So it's not like a kerem that then became had a bald spot in the middle where it has to be 16 amma. They say even 8 amma apart from one another, these rows don't combine to form a legal vineyard that requires a larger 4 amma gap between it and everything else. Mazel Tov, beginning the 5th parak. Kerem Shachorov, a vineyard that was destroyed. We're going to see it was mostly destroyed. There was a monsoon or a hurricane or some other issue. If he could rescue enough vines to have 10 in a Beit Seah, and then replant them according to halacha in the right configuration, it's a poor kerem. So it's a messed up kerem, but it's still legally a vineyard. Kerem dol shehunatu of irbuvia. If it was planted in a jumble, it's all mixed up. Im yeshbo lekoven shtayim neged shalosh. If there are in any place in this vineyard 2 plants, two grape plants next to 3, so they can be sort of, you can find a place where it's aligned in our normal pattern that we saw in the last parak. Reze kerem, it's considered legally a kerem, and the other vines are all part of this kerem, even if they're not lined up in the rows. Im lov eno kerem. If you don't have the right configuration, it's not legally a kerem. Rabbi Meir Omer, hoil u'fehu nirei ketavnit kramim, since it looks like kramim still, harei ze kerem, it's still a kerem, even if you don't have the remaining vines lined up in the 2 keneged 3, in that configuration we saw in the last parak. It would still be legally a kerem, even though these things are sort of spread out now, because it was originally a kerem and still has that tavnit, that shape. Shkoyach Rabosai.